having such terrible thoughts. You'd say that it won't happen, but you said you'd help and you haven't. I've been cutting everyone off, get a head start on my run. I won't be your sheep, your coin, or your son. These are just in the predicates, coherent yet unknown names. Oh, can you put me in codes? 'Cause I was born for this language game. To fall on your side means that I lie. On the other, I would die. I just crucify. I just crucify. I just crucify. I just crucify.
What's up, everybody?
Man, get Haden on RuPaul's Drag Race. That was some great
Yeah.
lip syncing while the song was going
We're-
on.
Yeah, our special guest was really getting into that, which was nice. Nice to watch his air drumming skills. Welcome to Apocalypse Here, Christianity You Can Live With.
Hi, everybody.
We're doing this live stream basically to field some Q&A from y'all in the chat.
Yeah.
About the recent debate review videos that we did on William Lane Craig and Greg Boyd's debate on penal substitution. A couple of housekeeping things before we bring in our guest, whom we already gave it away early on,
Oh,
so
yeah.
it's not a surprise guest. But in the description of the video, you'll find the resources that we were kind of drawing from in our debate review videos. So there's like a kind of a little bibliography there for those of you who want to read more about the topics that were touched on there. And then we have a link to Haden's channel, Help Me Believe, as well, and his Twitter. So with that, we'll bring in our guest, Haden. Woo!
Hey, everybody.
Haden's big return to YouTube.
Yes,
Yeah,
big
I don't know why-
anticlimactic
I mean,
return
why
to
have you been gone so long? I don't understand what happened. Like, are you okay?
Yeah. No, so
Gender?
I had a child, my first child, and then I went to fire school for 2 weeks, so I've been changing careers to now a certified firefighter EMT in the state of Texas. So, and between that and the kiddo, I have been quite busy. So I took a hiatus or something like that.
Yeah. So, yeah, Hayden's a dad, which is crazy.
Scary.
Yeah.
Scary.
Thank you for naming your child after me too. I
Yeah,
appreciate
that
that.
was really
That
sweet.
it was an honor, really. Yeah, John DePue Clark. Yeah.
Adorable baby girl. So-
Yes, I'm sure she won't have any trouble with that name. Yeah.
She'll be fine.
Yeah,
School
that's
is really easy on young children too. So
With weird
Yeah, especially middle school. Middle school's
yeah,
was the
especially
easiest.
once you get to that, like you're good for the rest of
Yeah.
your life.
Yeah.
Middle school.
Yeah,
That's
it's
really
definitely-
Yeah, being a middle school girl is especially easy.
Right.
So,
I bet.
right. Well, so I thought we'd start by
congrats to the new
yeah,
parents,
congrats
everybody.
to
Everyone give it up for
Hayden.
Haden and baby girl. So,
Yes. And definitely not Hayden's wife because she didn't do anything.
oh yeah,
No.
oh yeah, I forgot about her.
Hayden did most of it.
She deserves a lot of credit. Yeah, she's done quite a bit.
All right, so I thought we'd kind of get started by asking Haden, who has some, I'm assuming, questions prepared, kind of in the light of the debate.
Did we ask him to
And-
do that? Or did
Yeah, we were
okay.
talking about it. So yeah, no, you're on the spot. You got to come up with them now.
Hayden, what did you write down?
So I mean, I have some stuff about the original debate, and
Great.
I just
yeah,
have-
yeah,
So
that's great,
that
that's
was
great.
kind of my first kind of question to you, and it seems like you're kind of thinking in the same way.
Yeah.
Is just your sort of general impression, I guess, about the original debate on Unbelievable. Kind of your thoughts on that
Yeah.
first, and then we'll kind of move from there. But yeah,
yeah. I'm sorry if this is bad. It's Greg Boyd, right? That's the name of the person.
Greg
who
Boyd,
wrote-
yeah.
Yeah.
So it was kind of, I mean, I knew what Craig would come out and say. I've read a lot of his work, and I'm familiar with the penal substitutionary atonement theory. I once probably held to it just kind of intuitively myself, just because that's what was taught in church. I didn't know that's what it was called, that sort of stuff. So I was quite familiar with that position. So I was really looking forward to hearing what this Greg Boyd fellow would have to say. Even though I'll be quite honest, I did not know who he was prior to this, even though I probably should have.
Mhm.
But I just felt like he went off on maybe some tangents that weren't essential to what a critique of the penal substitutionary atonement theory should be. And like you guys were mentioning, that he's seated quite a bit, like the law court analogy and things like that. But yeah, that was kind of my general impression. I wish that he would have pressed the question, because this is what I think it boils down to, is why does God have to kill Jesus in order to forgive us? I really wish he would have pushed that further. Or why does justice demand that someone must die in order for somebody else to be forgiven? I feel like that's, like, philosophically, theologically, that's kind of what the essential question comes down to for me. What do you guys think?
I think it's well spotted. Yeah.
Yeah. I also
yeah.
think it would have helped to give a little bit more of a bit more of an entry-level discussion into what Christus Victor is. Because in my experience, people can mean a lot of things when they mean Christus Victor. Like, I think sometimes people can kind of...
It's not self-evident.
Right? Right. Because, when you get to the, more patristic readings, you're going into more of a full-on ransom theory that often involves a pretty developed idea of, demonology, basically. And then you can also get people who I think just honestly sound more like E.P. Sanders, who sound a bit more like, oh, it's being in Christ, that Christ died and now we're in him, and, Christ rose over death and we did too. So I feel like that's the more like Pauline modern version you hear sometimes, but I think it's worth clarifying exactly what you mean when you mean Christus Victor, especially because it's just not intuitive. Like Christ triumphs over something, how he does it, the resurrection's involved, but so.
Yeah, I think that would have been helpful too, because I think sort of later on in the debate, Greg mentioned what the sort of problem was, and he talked about it in terms of the powers, which are a very specific sort of set of actors and agents in Paul's cosmology. He didn't really mention sort of sin and death specifically as a kind of power in the way that I think Paul is using that. So he has this specific idea of the powers, and I know because Greg is really interested in sort of the political dimension of that. There's a sense in which we're also freed from the sort of oppressive political powers as well. So he'll kind of draw on some liberational readings, which is why he really likes Walter Wink a lot.
Right.
And that came through in his sort of his reference to what was it, the myth of redemptive violence kind of stuff that came through a couple times. But it just seemed kind of fuzzy what he was talking about with the Christus Victor. Occasionally, like I said, you'd get kind of glimpses into what he was really seeing as the main problem that Christ is actually sort of delivering us from.
Right. And I think, so I'm not trying to monologue too much, Hayden, but I think there's a reason why dismantling PSA and proposing an alternative are two different projects. And I think that in the context of the debate, it kind of all turned into one thing. So, and to be fair, I feel like I've been in the same situation before doing a debate when you're trying to both go after problems you see in stuff someone else is saying, and then also trying to say what you have in this exchange. Otherwise, it's just basically epistemological hopelessness. And it's really hard. It's really hard to do both. So I really empathize with Greg Boyd there. I feel like that was kind of how I felt talking to Licona. Just that I think the historical provability of the resurrection is it's a bad case. We don't need it. And I think there's a much easier and stronger approach to take to this, which is, kind of focusing on, the historical tradition of the church and the creeds and, the experience of the church right now. And so, it's hard to do all that in one go. So trying to not be too critical, but
yeah. There was also, if I may, I don't know, did you want to move on to something else?
Go for it, man. Yeah.
Just about the general, the original debate. There was also, he did ask him the question that I just brought up a second ago, which is, why does God have to kill Jesus in order to forgive us? But then Craig, he appealed to the law court analogy, or to think of it less as personal forgiveness and more as a legal pardon, I think is what he said.
Yes.
And so, like, the question, why does God have to kill Jesus in order to forgive us, doesn't make sense, or makes, like, that really proves a point if you're talking about personal forgiveness. But since we're talking about legal pardon, now all of a sudden it's all cleared up. But I think it's and this is where I wish Greg would have, Boyd would have pushed more.
Yeah.
Instead he went to the whole, well, I think it's fundamentally this organic punishment, and that the law court analogy is secondary to the, or I think he was using the term again. Instead, I think, I mean, of course, I'm, calling shots here from the bleachers, or however you want to word that. But instead, I think he should have just said, how does that fix anything? It's anything but obvious that appealing to the law court analogy suddenly solves this. Yeah. Like, it's like a magic wand. Oh, it's a law court analogy. But I can't, and Laura's a history major. I'm not a history major, but I can't think of a single law court throughout all of history that has ever thought it just to kill someone else in order to legally pardon another person, let alone kill an innocent person. Like, it doesn't resolve the problem at all. If anything, it intensifies it.
I mean, it almost makes you think of Girard, right? Like the Girard idea of the scapegoat, which again doesn't really have anything to do with law courts. And, the way Girard constructs that, and obviously a lot of this has been criticized, is that, like, the idea of killing everyone agreeing together to kill the innocent person to stop the blood feud and to stop the cycle of revenge is not a product of an organized, disinterested judicial system. It is the result of a vengeance-driven blood feud. So
we would all agree that that's unjust, including Craig, I'm sure. Yeah, and we would all agree that that's unjust, including Craig, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, but you'll notice that because Greg Boyd actually kind of pointed that out, like, how does it make sense for someone who's truly innocent to be punished and somebody who is actually truly guilty to be pardoned? How is that actually sort of just, even in a law court scenario? And William Lane Craig sort of backed up and was like, well, it's not really a biblical question, it's not really a theological question, it's really a philosophical question. So I'm going to go to modern sort of philosophical and also juridical examples of ways that can sort of make sense of that. And even his examples weren't quite that helpful. But it was interesting that once he got to a point where he felt like he couldn't answer that sort of theologically or textually, it's just, okay, let's go to the philosophical stuff. And then that makes sense of
and I'm probably less inclined to have a problem with that as yourself, but it didn't, I don't know, it doesn't help the case in my opinion stuff either. I think that your theory of anything theological is going to have to be, you're going to have an exegetical case,
absolutely,
a theological case, and it's going to have to philosophically cohere.
Absolutely.
So I don't have a problem talking about that. The problem is that I don't think there's much of a case exegetically, all the above. But anyway.
And surely we can also all agree that when you're talking about divine justice and describing divine justice, and you need to find a way to explain this by looking at like British American courts. It's like, oh, well, sometimes they construct these fictional narratives that are useful for arriving at a verdict. How do we know that's justice? Like, how do we know that that's correct? It seems to start with the assumption that Anglo-American courts are just. Therefore, if God does something similar, they are just, which attributes, I think, a level of inspiration and sophistication to Anglo-American law courts that I would not want to concede to be honest. So,
Well, I mean, at that point, it's like, well, I mean, I guess I was going to say it's eisegesis, but I guess if you're making a because the biblical writers obviously wouldn't have had that kind of analogy in mind. But I guess if you're making a philosophical argument, that wouldn't make that much sense. But yeah,
Right. I mean, that was sort of what I was talking about a few times with, I could sense a little bit of a projection coming from our modern kind of realities, especially criminal justice realities, kind of imposing that onto God, and then kind of vice versa. Once you get into that cycle, it's hard to sort of get out of, where you project onto God,
Right.
and then you see that in the text, and then that informs how you're actually seeing things in the world.
yeah. I think you got to do it the opposite way. You got to, I think, when it comes to philosophy, I guess. How do I want to say this? When it comes to biblical doctrines like the Atonement, the only place that we can go to even know that there is such a thing as a doctrine of atonement is to the biblical text. Like, that's where it comes from.
Yeah,
sure.
I mean, I'm not going to be able to reason using my senses and then philosophically reasoning to something like an. I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, you can't just find that by reading the cosmos.
So what the role that philosophy has here is, okay, let's interpret the text and try to do it as that's true to the author's intent, or however you want to word that, and exegete what the author was getting at. And then once we get that, then we can step back and say, okay, does this philosophically cohere? And if it doesn't, my inclination is to go, I think I probably made a mistake in my exegesis.
Yeah.
It's not, I mean, perhaps the biblical author is just completely incoherent, but my first assumption is that I've made a mistake in the exegesis.
That's right. We're on the same page there for sure. With we should begin with coherence and not begin with some sort of idea of incoherence in terms of our starting point for exegesis. If there is some sort of incoherence that arises, it's probably something we're doing wrong in our readings of the text. So
I can't find my crochet hook. Do you mind if I go look for it?
No, go for it.
Okay. Excuse me 1 second, guys. Sorry.
Oh, we got this.
Just interrupting the stream.
Sorry.
There was something that Laura said that I was gonna add to or comment. I can't remember now. But anyway.
Let me pull up. There was one kind of question early on in the chat. I'm gonna pull up from Jacob. Does PSA presuppose that the Israelites offered their sacrifices as penalty for sins?
Right.
In the sense that Jews viewed their sacrifice. Yeah, we talked about this in the second review video. That's not how the temple sacrifice system actually worked. It wasn't about the sacrifices weren't punitive or retributive in nature. It was much more about cleansing.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is that the blood, and can you correct me if I'm wrong, but the blood of the animals is never applied to the sinner or the person.
It's applied to the horn.
It's always applied to the tabernacle or the temple or the things inside the tabernacle, which is, to me, pretty informative.
Yeah. I don't know Old Testament scholars, Hebrew Bible scholars, who see a penal function to the temple outside of people who are approaching this as a background for evangelical theological concerns. I just don't think, when you look at folks like Milgrom, like a few years ago, I was doing a project on Passover imagery in John, and I remember, every book had like one footnote of, and then the one person who thinks the Passover imagery is penal. And it like all goes back to the same sort of like conservative fundamentalist writer in 1911. It's just like that's where those concerns come from. So it's not, it doesn't arise out of the text. And I think betrays a little bit of a demythologizing tendency, to be honest. I think that sometimes Christian interpreters of the Hebrew Bible can be a little, we want to see our theology reflected back from the ancient mind. And I just don't think that's how history works. Like they saw the world differently from us. Yeah. Abraham was not a 21st century evangelical American, and that's okay. So, but
it's okay.
It should be okay.
If it's not, we have a problem.
I'm going to call out Spartan theology because you mentioned Passover. He and I were chatting a bit earlier. So Spartan, if you could ask your kind of question about Passover to Laura in the chat, that would be cool. Sure. You don't have to. Don't feel pressured to do it.
Feel pressured.
You have to.
It was a good kind of direction to take this, and I'm glad that.
She's on the window. I thought I saw him moving.
Waiting on him to do that, I remember what I was going to say earlier. Laura was saying something made me think of this. Whenever the question was, why does God have to kill Jesus in order to forgive us? And a lot of times the answer that you'll get is, well, God's justice demands that someone be punished. But that just,
Right.
I don't
well,
know. That just, how's that? It just doesn't make any sense to me. That justice would demand that just any old buddy can die in your, I don't know. It's weird.
Yeah, it's because it's grounded in a certain conception of God's justice and holiness. So you'll hear holiness kind of used a lot in this kind of discussion.
Yeah, it's
Where
holiness. Yeah, that's what I
God
meant to
has
say.
this
Not
sort
as justice.
essentially, God has this untouchable thing that
Mhm.
God needs to preserve at all costs, right?
Yeah,
And
my
then
precious.
human sin, and that's an affront to that holiness and justice.
Right.
Um,
Which is like, well, and you may or may not, but like, if you believe in impassibility, and we talked about that before. It's
yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
and God's not you're not hurting God. You can't hurt God. He's God.
Yeah. Yeah.
I saw a question on the chat, which I think is fair. That weren't animal sacrifice.
Oh, we already addressed that.
Oh,
yeah.
you did?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, I mean, one thing I do just want to say is that, like, atonement is our word for this stuff. Atonement is not atonement is a word that basically English speakers had to come up with to describe the ritual process. The word this is coming from out of Hebrew is kippur, so Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. And for, scholars have tried to figure out, like, what's the root of this word? What does this mean? And the challenge here is that, honestly, just kippur means to make an atoning sacrifice. You probably have heard before in sermons the idea that it's related to the word to cover, because it's the peel form of kafar. And kafar seems to mean something like covering. It's a hapax. It's used to describe Noah covering the yeah, so which means it only occurs once in one context. So to kafar, it's the word that Noah that's used to describe Noah covering the ark with pitch. So this is the peel, which is sometimes like an intensification stem of that. So you've probably heard in sermons before the idea that this means to cover completely, to completely blot out, and that's just kind of a bad Hebrew reading of this, like, that words with the same stem have to all be related to each other. Right. And that's just not necessarily the case. So we don't have a great understanding of what that word might mean outside of a sacrificial context, because no one ever uses it outside of a sacrificial context. It just means to make an atoning sacrifice. And to talk about what happens there, you're definitely removing, like, ritual impurities and moral impurities, which are related in some capacity, but you still are never really entering into the language of, like, payment or substitution. It's just
the interesting thing. Sorry,
yeah, go for it.
Well, now you made me want to make a comment. I had a question for you. I'll go ahead and ask the question first. Would you agree that the word that appeasing is probably the wrong word to interpret there? Like you're appeasing God by making the sacrifices?
Well, because stuff does, there is pleasing and appeasing language used in Leviticus to describe rituals. Yeah, God likes the smell of sacrifices. Yeah. But I think it's hard to figure out. I think it's hard to fit that stuff into some kind of, you're necessarily angry, like God's angry, and then you give him the animal, and then now he stops being angry. It's more just sort of a generalizedness that God enjoys the experience of being sacrificed to.
The way I've always understood the sacrifices, and like I was talking about earlier, kind of how it's never applied to the people, it's applied to the place, is that it's purifying the land and that space so that God can dwell with Israel.
Yeah, it's the maintenance of sacred space. So if you're going to have a temple where the temple is going to be where your God is, and you can spend time with that God, and the space needs to be clean enough for the God to live there, and the way you maintain that is through sacrifice. So this is something Israel shares with other ancient Near Eastern places, and then later on the Greco-Roman world. So
one more thing for Laura before we go on. I see the comment up there though. You're talking about the ritual impurity, ritual sins. The interesting thing to me, at least, is that when it comes to moral things in the Old Testament, there's no atonement. Like if you murder somebody, you're gonna die.
Well, your death is the atonement. That's
Right.
the issue. Yeah. There's no substitution there. And a lot of that also comes back to, again, all this stuff is interacting with purity categories. And it doesn't map well into our system because the concern there is that blood guilt is really bad. It's really poisonous. You don't want that in your land, which is why even if somebody is found dead, you have to atone for that murder. Right. It's not, well, once we found the person, then they're going to pay for what they did. And now we've got it all figured out. You have to pay for the blood of that person because the blood of that person is polluting and dangerous. So that's a huge theme that goes throughout the entire Hebrew Bible. And eventually Matthew picks up on it to explain why the temple was destroyed. That, eventually just things got so toxic. It had to, that the temple couldn't be saved anymore. So that's also an interesting complication with the penal substitution idea. If the sentence for sin is death, how come there are sins that you can't atone for except through a murder? Like, why doesn't the substitution work anymore? So and
it's worth noting that the death in that scenario, in that sort of moral scenario, is not a law court. It's not a forensic scenario in the way that someone like William Lane Craig was talking about it.
We talk about the animal sacrifice?
No, just death as something that has to do with the death being the sort of, I guess, atonement.
The natural solution to a murder.
That's not a law court scenario, is what I'm saying. And I think William Lane Craig was reading that as such because he was referencing Genesis 3.
Yeah.
He made a reference back to Genesis 3. And
and you guys pointed out the obvious, which is, I mean, all you have to do is read it. In the day that you eat of the fruit of the tree, you will die. I will kill you.
Right. That's right. That's right.
There's also the other thing when you're talking about sin and payment for it. There's the entire system of sanctuary cities is so complicated and so clearly designed to deal with the idea that the blood of an unjustly killed person is somehow like dangerously impure and toxic, because you've got this whole system that, you send that person has to go to a sanctuary city. It doesn't matter if they've been forgiven for the accidental death of a person or not. This is not to protect them. This is to contain the number of places where you have this toxic phenomenon of a person who's killed somebody walking around. So you have to keep them close to altars where you can keep them clean. So again, the through line with all this stuff is it doesn't demythologize well. It doesn't map onto our modern conceptions of justice, because that's not what it's about. It's about purity. It's about pollution. So that
I think you have to keep that in mind when you come to the New Testament understanding of the Atonement.
Yeah,
you think so?
Right.
Somebody mentioned Thiessen in the comments.
Yeah, that was Isaac. I put it up here. I just want to give this a quick shout out to Isaac. It's
it's on the screen.
Yeah, I put it up there.
I just finished Thiessen's book today, Jesus and the Forces of Death by Matthew Thiessen. It's so good.
So Isaac was a div school buddy who's a pastor.
Hi, Isaac. Nice
Thanks for coming on the chat. Thanks a lot, man. Go ahead on this. I mean, I think this is just exactly.
Milgrom wrote the classic Leviticus commentary that's really useful for understanding the sacrifice system and the temple system, for why it works and how it works. And Thiessen just wrote a great book on Jesus and the Forces of Death, is what it's called. I used it a lot for my New Testament review video on exorcism, and I'm going to be drawing from it a lot for my next one, which is on leprosy. But he's really interested in the idea that as Christians, we kind of sometimes impose this narrative on New Testament texts that Jesus overturns the purity system, and he sort of exposes the vacuousness of it and how it's not real. And he does things like touch lepers because, it's not real. You don't need to worry about impurity anymore. And he goes through and basically shows all the ways in which in the New Testament, Jesus actually scrupulously upholds purity laws. And when he encounters impurity, deals with the source of the impurity, and then tells people to go make the requisite sacrifice and to have dealt with it completely. So, again, these are ancient texts. They have ancient ways of thinking, and that's okay. So,
before we take any more from the chats, because Haden doesn't have all the time in the world because he's a dad, I'm going to let him kind of drive the conversation for a bit. If you have any more kind of questions or comments, go for it, man.
I can rant about the original debate, or
rant
I
as
can
much as
ask,
Go nuts.
or I
That's
can
essentially
ask
what
you
we
a
did, so-
question. Maybe I'll do both. So I guess maybe I'll throw out kind of how I think about the atonement in response to Craig and Boyd, and see what your guys' comments are on it.
Sure.
So I don't think that Jesus's death on the cross makes it possible for God to forgive us. That's how it's often put by the PSA theorists, the penal substitutionary atonement. But that just doesn't make any sense to me, I guess, for the reasons we've already been discussing. He just certainly doesn't have to kill an innocent person in order to forgive us, even if you want to think of it as a law court analogy. I mean, when it comes to personal forgiveness, I don't have to kill someone in order to forgive a friend or forgive my wife or somebody like that. Obviously, I can just forgive them. When it comes to a legal category, the president of the United States doesn't have to kill someone, let alone an innocent person, in order to legally pardon someone else. I mean, if he did, we would arrest him. It just doesn't make any sense.
Right.
I think that God forgives the truly repentant. I mean, I'm not a universalist, so I'm sure John would want to qualify that, or maybe you agree with that. I don't know, but I think that God forgives the truly repentant. I think we talked about this before. I really liked what I found in Athanasius.
Yeah.
Where he said, if it was just about forgiveness, then the cross would have been unnecessary, or Jesus' death and resurrection would have been unnecessary. I can't remember what the exact quote was. It was basically like that. I think that's right, because if it's just about forgiveness, all you have to do is truly repent and truly ask for God to forgive you. And he's merciful. He's just. He's good. That's what
Which
he
he
wants.
does in the Old Testament all the time.
Yeah.
Exactly. He seeks, God seeks a humble heart. That's what he wants. He wants you to, in humility, come to him and say, I'm sorry, I've messed up. Please forgive me. That sort of stuff. And the death, I think, cannot be divorced from the resurrection. I think that you're not really going to understand the atonement. What the atonement does, apart from the resurrection. So Jesus' death and resurrection, like you were mentioning, it rescues us from sin and death specifically by way of the resurrection. I don't want to just say that we get the death for free. Really what we need is the resurrection, but almost. I mean, it is the resurrection that for me kind of carries us across the finish line, because the punishment or the consequence, however you want to word it, is death. And what we need, obviously, is to be rescued from death. And the way that we are is because Jesus defeated death in his resurrection. Like, he literally, in the most literal sense, defeated death. He rose from the dead. And we too, and he's the guarantor, of course, as you read in Romans, Galatians, all over the place, that he is the guarantor of our own resurrection, our future resurrection. And of course, I do believe that we can experience that right now because of the participation aspect of it as well. We unite to Christ. I believe you unite to Christ through faith. And in so doing, we die to sin and with Christ, and we will also rise with Christ in the resurrection. That to me is what the atonement is about.
That participatory element. Yeah.
Beautiful stuff, man. Yeah.
No.
I think
complaints.
the thing that I would add a bit to that,
sure,
would be, I think what the death is doing specifically. So I like to think of this in terms of a 2-act story. I don't know if I've talked about this in specifically that way, where you have the sort of first act of the atonement being the sort of a descent trajectory, where God becomes incarnate in Christ and assumes our sinful condition and then dies. So he's bearing and lowering all of the sort of problem and the sin and death and all that sort of stuff that's harming us and hurting us and affecting our condition, and then bears that to his death. So it's executed. So the death is the execution of that evil and sinful condition. And then Christ is raised out of that situation, beyond sin, beyond death, beyond flesh, beyond curse, into a new reality, right? And then we participate in that. So I think the death is functioning as a termination of that awful condition specifically. I think that's the only thing that I would add. to what you're saying.
I mean, I understand what you're saying, and like to some extent, like I just want to nod my head and say, yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
But then there's this part of me that's like, okay, it's not really probably a major problem for what you just said, but I think about this. So, Paul was united to Christ, right, in his death and resurrection. But
Yeah.
even Paul would have said that his flesh still waged war against him, and that he wanted to do what was right, but he found himself, obeying the flesh, that sort of stuff. So it's like, while he says that he died to it, I don't know. It's like, well, at the same time, he clearly didn't, or he wouldn't have just said that. And I feel the same way. It's like, yeah, I feel like I've died to sin, in some sense, in that I'm united to Christ in his death. I read that in the scriptures. But at the same time, it's like, unless I'm totally mistaken about that, it's like, I still give into the flesh. I still sin, that sort of stuff. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah. I think this is just the issue of being located where we are in space and time. So you talked about Christ being our guarantee, basically being our guarantee of being resurrected. So he's kind of in front of us. He's already raised and seated at the right hand of the Father, right? That's true and real now. But we're kind of behind him on that journey, even though we're participating in him. We're kind of lagging behind that in a sense, because we're contingent and fallen beings still. We're in space and time in a way that Christ is not. So we're dealing with this funky like space-time issue, I think. This is something that I think T.F. Torrance is actually quite helpful with. That it's kind of like the already but not yet eschatology,
Right.
but I think it's a bit more sort of overlapping. That we are really participating in Christ's resurrection now, and that breaks into our reality. We live out of that as Christians, being new creations and all of that.
Sure.
But we're still a part of this fleshly condition that is, from our point of view, not completely gone.
Yeah.
We still sin, we still mess up, we
Right.
we still do horrible things to one another and collaborate.
So maybe it's more like we're dying to sin. We're not dead.
Yeah.
to
Maybe,
sin.
If we were to kind
If
of
you really want to parse things out, and I know that when I was going to say spoke, but wrote these things, he probably wasn't counting on being so scrutinized. But
But yeah, I think it's just the weirdness of being in our current position where we're kind of between the two ages, where they're kind of converging right now.
yeah,
We're
That
both
makes
raised completely, but also kind of not. There's this funky
Right.
overlap here. And that's why Paul's language about it is so weird. He'll talk about resurrection has actually happened to you. And he'll also say, well, it's not quite there yet. We're still awaiting being fully raised. So he's dealing with this sort of the bizarreness of this, I think.
Yeah. I have a question on retributive justice, unless Laura had anything to add to what we were just saying.
I think that covered it.
So this should be juicy. I don't know. We'll see. So I mean, I am an annihilationist, and so I obviously do believe that God is going to punish the wicked, and for what they've done. And so, let me actually start by asking you exactly what you mean by retributive justice. Whenever you critique it, like, what do you? How do you define it, and what are you critiquing?
Yeah, it's essentially someone getting what they deserve. So it's kind of balancing the books, right?
Yeah.
Someone does something, they deserve this thing. So it's within the sort of moral discussion of desert, is what I would say.
I guess I'm thinking that, and that I don't want to make any kind of moral or moral philosophical argument that says it is fine, it is good, or whatever. I just think, isn't that kind of what God does in the Old Testament, kind of all the time? Like he punishes Israel for their idolatry. I mean, he sends nations against them, and then he turns around and punishes those nations for what they did to Israel, and he punishes them for their idolatry too. I don't know. I guess I fail to see how that's not retributive.
One thing I would want to just talk about there is also the telos. So, generally speaking, in like classic retributive justice, so, like, let's say the American justice system, the end of where the offender ends up is not really a consideration, right? That you basically give somebody, it doesn't. So, in our retributive justice system, if you kill somebody, we send you to prison for the rest of your life. And we don't really give a damn if you're ever sorry, if you ever if you ever seek forgiveness from the people you harmed, or if you ever change as a person. The goal is basically just to make you suffer in return. Like, that's basically the entire purpose. And I think when I look at the narrative of the Old Testament, just by virtue of being a narrative, that's clearly not the interest. Especially when you look at the covenant codes in Deuteronomy, there is a very clear, if you do X, then Y will happen, or if you do X, I will do Y. But I think there's an interesting question there of what is the purpose? Because what doesn't happen is, if you break the covenant, I will rain down hellfire on you, and deuces. There's a goal of restoring the relationship there. That the goal of basically turning up the heat by causing these, by causing plagues or invasions, is the writers of the Old Testament understand it, is to get people to repent. And that's and that is, I think, very different from the American criminal justice system, because we don't care if people repent, but God does in the Hebrew Bible.
Maybe a whole separate question about the American justice system. No, but okay, so that's interesting. I thought that's probably what you would say, and I'm glad you did, because I agree with it 100%. I could just be wrong about what the term retributive justice means, because I'm not adding to the definition of retributive justice the purpose or the end in where you end up at, like you were talking about. I agree with you that God's purpose for punishment, judgment, whatever, is restorative. That's what he wants the final goal to be. I mean, that could not be more clear throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. I specifically think about, is it in one of the pastorals where somebody says that the day of the Lord is delayed specifically so that more people will repent?
I think it actually might be the Petrines, but
it's probably Peter. Like, I mean, I don't think that could be more clear.
Right.
I guess that just wasn't. I think I was thinking of retributive justice as more of synonymous with vengeance, and I think that God.
Yeah, I think retribution, and one thing I also want to distinguish between is, non-retributive justice is not an absence of consequences. Those are not the same things at all. And I think that's worth talking about. It's like when people talk about restorative alternatives to justice in the United States, they don't mean anarchy. They don't mean you can do whatever you want, there's no consequences. Right. They mean,
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
They mean a justice system that is carried out with an eye to restoring an offender to the community and being rehabilitated and reintegrated, which almost always involves very unpleasant processes for that person.
Right, because part of that process is actually confronting the stuff you've done wrong, and oftentimes in restorative circle processes, you're actually confronting the people that you've harmed. Specifically, you're in the room with them. You see them face to face, and you're talking to them. So you're actually confronted with the consequences of what you've done, but it's ultimately toward the aim of being restored.
So what do you do when, here's the follow-up question. What do you do when someone refuses to be restored?
I'm not an expert in this process.
In what sense?
Like someone's not interested.
So the purpose of God, and you can think of it from God's perspective, I guess. It doesn't.
So you're talking more sort of theologically.
But I mean, either way is fine, because it's going to be analogous one to the other. But what do you do? So if God's purpose of judgment, punishment, that sort of stuff, I mean, the stuff that I listed in the Old Testament, things like that, if the purpose is to restore people, what happens when those people just flat out are stubborn, or whatever, however you want to think of it, refuse to be restored?
According to Matthew 18, you wait them out. You basically put them outside the community where they can't hurt anybody, and you wait them out. I'm actually reminded of the movie The Nightingale. They have this exact conversation at one point about what do you do with people who just are never going to be sorry. Of course, the way that movie ends is you kill them. But yeah, I mean, I think so. I don't know. I'm not an expert in there are people you can talk to.
No, so what I would say to that is people, because God is the good and is the telos of all of our beings, I don't think ultimately anyone will be able to ultimately reject the good and the truth and the fulfillment of our being. I don't think that's possible. I think God, because this is the fulfillment of who all of us are as God's creation, I don't think even though it seems like now, and it's not just seems, people are actively resisting the purposes of God and the truth and the good, but I don't think that's going to be ultimate, because I think that God is ultimately going to pull people back. Even if that looks like overriding our wills, I think it's just going to happen.
I also don't want to hear people saying, well, doesn't God respect our free will? Well, no, for the same reason you don't respect the free will of your toddler who wants to jump into the deep end of a pool with no floaties. You know, that at some point, part of being a parent is you do set limits. So, yeah.
So I like John's answer, because I've said this before and I'll continue to say it again. You're very consistent. That's where I figured you would have to, or would go, and that makes sense.
Oh yeah, that's absolutely where I go. I mean, this is yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, what did we say before, that Bartians are consistent Calvinists or something like that?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Some of this is drawing on David Bentley Hart's work too, who's not really a Bartian.
No,
But
yeah, I mean, I understand. That makes more sense. I'm just trying to understand like your position.
But yeah, that's where I would go. What I would say.
Sorry, I remember what I was going to ask, if I can. Sorry. So if that was not the case, that it is the case that yes, actually, you can refuse God as long as you like, forever, your whole life, whatever. Would it then be unjust for God to say, on my view, they will be annihilated?
Can you rephrase? Can you say that one more time? You don't have to rephrase it.
Would you? So I know that you say that, or you believe that it's impossible to actually refuse God forever. Eventually, you're going to give in. He's just too good. It is what you desire, and eventually, eventually you will see it that way. But imagine that that's not the case, that actually you can refuse God, despite him being the highest good and all of that. You can actually refuse him. Would it then be unjust for God to annihilate or give you over to your folly or whatever?
Interesting. Yeah, in that scenario, if that's the case and God ultimately doesn't heal and restore our wills and align us back perfectly to the good, if that's not going to happen, then I think within that sort of alternative system that you were suggesting, I mean, it seems like it would be consistent within that for God to annihilate people.
But why would it be just for God to let you go on with your distorted
But
will?
we're assuming that this is the case.
Okay,
that this is just sort of the reality that's been set up. I think within that.
I think I was asking what Laura was getting at. What did you?
Yeah, because I think this is hard because just the whole thing is a counterfactual. I don't think it would be just for God to let somebody go on in their resistance. For the same reason, it would not be just for a medical doctor to never medicate someone who's suffering from schizophrenic delusions because that person does not want to be medicated. I think it would be equally unjust for that doctor to say, well, that's what they want, so I have to not do it. You know, of course, I'm also making some, I don't know the medical ethics literature here, but I think most of us really agree.
Well, I don't know what it is for schizophrenics, but if you are what we'll refer to as A&O times 4, if you know who you are, you know what day it is, you answer all the right questions, and you refuse, there's nothing we can do. Like I can't make you do it.
So I think that so this is actually kind of getting to the heart of the issue. This is where Hart's helpful. I don't think there's any point at which someone would truly know the good and reject it.
Coming to a rational perspective.
Well, it's quite Thomistic of him, or Aristotelian of him.
So if somebody is rejected, then they haven't yet actually really kind of been confronted by the good, right? So
they've either suppressed it, which where that comes from.
Yeah.
Where that comes from, and you don't think that was actually
right. So that would be Romans 18:32.
Yeah.
I just don't think that's even a scenario in reality.
Yeah. So I guess it comes down to if you think that's a scenario. But so you would say that if that was a scenario, then something like annihilation might make more sense, or
yeah, I mean, I would be.
It depends how much
if that was the scenario. Then
it depends how much credence I think you want to give to people's ability to choose the best thing for themselves, or how much respect God has for our judgments of what we want or need. So I guess to me it seems like if we're really leaning into the parent-child relationship, that's a hard thing to draw out.
Yeah, and for me, when we're talking about like God sort of leaving room for our kind of will and like respecting kind of our freedom to choose or whatever, as if the more involvement God has in our lives, the less kind of freedom we have. I think that's actually presupposing God being a sort of being among other beings, instead of the creator and the good, who is sovereign and Lord over all things. So I think we can kind of quickly slip into describing God as kind of a being in the same way that we are, if we see them as kind of competitive. But I don't think God is that. I think God is the Lord and is a being that is totally and wholly other than we are and transcends that. So yeah.
Good stuff.
Great question. And I like the way you're thinking about this. And I like, sorry, that sounded like a teacher to a student. I did not mean it to at all.
It is a teacher to a student. I can learn from anybody.
No, but I enjoy thinking about this stuff. Because I think these are the kinds of questions people naturally ask when they're faced with this material. And I think it's worth talking about. And I think it's good to treat this stuff like, these are questions that really matter. And I think that a lot of this has to do with how we conceive of ourselves is rational. Sorry?
Yeah, and other people.
That's where it comes from a lot for me is like, how should I view these other people? But
yeah, right. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, for me, I'm not that concerned with leaving some sort of adequate space for our will and our autonomy and initiative in all of this. I'm really wanting to sort of rely on God. I mean, this is my Calvinism kind of showing, right? I think that the sovereign Lord of all things is the one who knows what's best for us, and trusting that, and trusting God to sort of heal our wills is kind of where we need to go. And I think ultimately everyone will.
It's definitely an appealing system. The one that you're putting forward.
Well, and I know diehard Wesleyans who are really insistent that, God has so much respect for free will. And some people, even if on the day of the Lord they have a chance to walk this back, they won't because they're so committed to it. And God has that much respect for us that they'll let them do that. And I get why that's a pacifying answer and why that is satisfying for some folks, because I think the thing that is operating there is the idea that that's anxiety about the fact that, like a sincerely questioning person who is unable to conjure belief in God in themselves, would God really damn them forever for not basically reading the tea leaves right, not knowing the right people, not being able to discern this, and when we get there, then we'll figure out the difference between the sincerely confused and the openly rebellious, and then the openly rebellious, those are the ones that go to hell. I still don't find that super satisfying though, because what happened to make people like that? And I think that what is operating there, and I think that to my mind, it's not. I don't know. I think that assigns so much gravitas to human experience and to human emotional response to stuff that I just don't think would be responsible if you were the Almighty. So that,
Yeah. Hayden, I have a quick question for you if you have some time.
I got a few more minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
no rush.
you mentioned when you were talking about the Old Testament stuff, and
As long as it's not difficult.
and I hope it's not. When we were talking about sort of retribution in the OT, you essentially said that the goal of God's justice is ultimately for restoration, right? That's kind of the goal.
Yeah, I guess I really meant to say something like punishment or something like that, but yeah.
Or so punishment, yeah. If the total sort of goal of all of this is for restoration, how does that make sense in relation to people getting annihilated?
Well, it's just because I
that
believe
would so that would suggest to me that the end of, or the telos of a punishment is just wiping somebody out. That doesn't seem...
that's where we come back to. Actually, I agree quite a bit with what Boyd was saying about the I keep forgetting what the word he used, organic.
Yeah, the organic punishment, yeah.
Nature of this thing. And of course, there's this sense in which, God set the system up in the first place. So in some sense, he's responsible for everything, even though I don't think he causes individual evils that happen in the world. There is some in the fact that he created everything. He's responsible in that sense. But whenever you read about death, it seems more like a natural consequence. If you reject the author of life, the natural consequence is death. And if you I think that you can flat out reject him for as long as you live, if you'd like. And then once you die, and that's it. I mean, you don't get another chance, not because God is so picky about whether you accept him in this life or that life. It's because you're dead. Once you die, you're dead, and that's it. You're no longer conscious. You're freaking dead. You flatline. Your brain no longer works, and you no longer have a chance to do anything because you're dead. And so I just think that's the natural consequence. We're all going to die, and the only reason any of us are going to come back to life, which I think is a physical resurrection. I don't believe in some kind of
disembodied
business. I don't believe in. Doesn't make any sense to me. So yeah, I guess that's basically it. I think it's just the natural consequence, and it is spoken of sometimes as
So I think something to think about would be how that makes sense in relation to an account of resurrection as well. So are people, non-believers, are they resurrected? Do they go beyond death?
This is a good question that's often debated in the annihilationist camp. It's like, is it like what I just said?
Kind of where you're coming from on this, because I know that there's a kind of debate within the camp.
The question is it like what I just said?
Yeah.
Where, hey, once you die, you're dead, bud. There's nothing else. I think that's the most intuitive thing to me. I mean, people die and they're dead. That's it.
Yeah. I think that would be
they didn't go anywhere. They decayed, and now they're in the ground feeding trees.
Yeah.
People don't like that because they think it's morbid or whatever. But and then or is it the case that there's a second, or that everyone is resurrected, and there's some sort of a second judgment in where God goes Haitza, and he smites them. In which case you would have been resurrected purely for the purpose of being annihilated, and which I just think on its face sounds absurd. But if you can make a good exegetical argument for it, then I guess my hands would be tied and I would accept it or whatever. I flatter myself as being tied to the text. Of course, anybody that disagrees with me on anything is going to be like, well, you got this wrong. But, I'm sure I do have a lot of things wrong.
I think
so I tend towards the more like, no, once you die, that's it. You're not going to be resurrected from the dead just to be annihilated. That would just be superfluous, for one thing.
Agreed.
You're already annihilated. You're already gone.
Yeah.
Why would God bring you back to life just to do it again?
That would be the most consistent, I would think, with the annihilationist position. But I do think that is working with both from time to time.
And then there's also the fact that the resurrection is a promised, like it's a benefit for those who believe. Like eternal life is the gift, and for those who believe and have faith, as far as I interpret John 3:16 and things like that. So it wouldn't make any sense that people who don't believe, they are also going to be resurrected. It's just like, it's a similar argument against eternal conscious torment, right? Well, everyone's going to live forever. They're going to live forever in hell, and some people are going to live forever in the resurrection, but everyone's going to live forever. So eternal life really isn't a gift, because the people who are supposedly rejected Christ, they're also going to get it. Yeah. It's just going to be a different location and unpleasant, but it's still eternal life.
One thing I'd also want to ask, that push back on that though, is eternal life in John some eschatological? Because I actually think John cuts both ways on this. I think there are a number of passages in John and I have to pull out Hugo Mendez's work on this again.
Well, I was going to say I probably both, but I mean, it's not something I thought deeply about.
Yeah. His argument is that the language of eternal life in John is primarily, John's mostly interested in the way it's a present reality for people, like life of the life of eternality. Yeah, life in the age.
So it's translating aionios differently than is sort of commonly interpreted, which is it's an eternal sort of thing. Where aionios can mean a lot of different things. It can mean a set age. We've talked about this before. Yeah. It's got some flexibility, I think, and I think we should be open to kind of open to those other kind of interpretations of it too.
It could be one of those words like pistis, where I think it's like
sure. Yeah.
I don't know Greek, but I know that word can mean a numerous of things. And whenever I hear people explain it, I'm like, yeah, well, based on the context in which I read it, it seems like all those things are true.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. Aaron, do you mind if I bug you for a second? You mentioned something is consistent with Jehovah's Witness theology. Do you mind if I ask which one it was? Because I'm always curious.
Oh, me. They're talking about me when I talk about annihilationism.
Really? Okay. Yeah. And I understand Jehovah's Witness is annihilationist, but I also.
But that doesn't mean I agree with Jehovah's Witness theology wholesale. I mean, I run into this a lot.
Annihilationism is also, I think, like a
so you are a Jehovah's Witness, is what you're saying?
Yes, what I'm saying is I'm a Jehovah's Witness. Yes, I've got this comment.
We got you on. I'll extract that soundbite and use it later.
Yeah.
They also believe in God, so everyone who believes in God is a Jehovah's Witness. There you go.
Well, I actually feel like annihilationism is becoming a creeping evangelical belief. I think
it's even more than that. It's becoming
mainstream.
Some real kind of.
Did you say creepy?
Creeping.
I say creeping.
Oh, okay. I was like, wow. I mean, shots fired. I mean, I don't get offended, but
it's I mean, there's obviously a huge difference between evangelicalism as it exists in pews and as it exists in evangelical seminaries and colleges. Like, those are two wildly different categories. But
for sure.
But in my experience in and around evangelical colleges, I feel like annihilationism is actually moving into default among professors, primarily because of like exegetical issues, largely. Of course.
Well, it's kind of like, I bet it's this. I mean, I think they're finding that the eternal conscious torment just has zero grounds exegetically.
Yeah, exegetically is really hard to get.
So as opposed to go and they're already conditioned to not accept universalism, so it's like
it's the offering. Yeah.
So just being conscious of time, Hayden, I know that you.
Sorry.
I've got a scat, and I apologize, Aaron, because I see that comment right there that she was actually talking about the resurrection of everyone for judgment, which I didn't agree with.
That's what you wanted to. So
I made an assumption about what you were talking about.
So
because someone else has said the same thing to me before, and I was like, I'm not a freaking Jehovah's Witness.
Sorry, Aaron, I wasn't trying to call you out. I was just curious what you're referring to, because I'm perpetually interested in how different biblical ideas manifest themselves in lived religion. So I just wanted to ask, and I hope that wasn't embarrassing for you. I just wanted to ask.
No, I apologize to Aaron. Thanks so much for joining us, Aaron, in the live chat.
Hayden, thank you so much for jumping on.
Oh my gosh, thank you for your time.
We really appreciated chatting with you.
It was great to see you.
Yeah, I missed you guys. I missed you guys a lot. Yeah.
You're kind of the reason we're doing all this. You kind of planted
Hey. So happy. They grow up so fast.
Yeah. So thanks, man. And I'm
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to seeing you back on your channel, bringing out
Yeah.
more content, good stuff there.
Yeah.
I put a link in the description to Hayden's channel, Help Me Believe.
Yeah.
So go check it out. He's got a lot of awesome stuff on there, not just videos with me. So
There's also videos with me.
Yeah.
so-
Right. Yes.
not as important. Yeah. Anyway,
All right,
thanks
guys.
so much. We'll see you later. We're gonna stay
Hayden.
on, but Hayden, thanks so much for coming.
Yeah. Yeah. Love you guys. Have a good one. See ya.
Love you, man.
Have a
See
good
ya.
night. Take care.
All right, let's take some questions.
All right,
We've got
yeah.
some.
I know it was fun. I haven't talked to Hayden in a minute. So, yeah.
Let's go back. So we did the PSA one there.
Craig was on here for a while.
He was. That was funny. Isaac left,
Oh.
but it took me a really long time to realize that he was saying law court and not Lockhart.
We'll talk about Carlos's question.
Yeah.
About
Argumentism.
cleansing and
Okay, so this was Spartan's kind of comment.
Mm.
Jesus is clearly connected to the Passover lamb in John 1. And when I took the Passover lamb, does not seem to function as a substitute at all, right? Seems
Yeah.
much more to do with purification or purity.
Yeah, the other thing with the Passover ritual is the use of blood as a ritual deterrent against spirits is often used as not just an expiatory rite, but sort of like a prophylactic rite, which seems to be the origins of the Exodus of the Exodus story and the way that the blood on the lentils is narrated. The idea is that you're going to use the blood of the lamb to keep away the angel of death. So I think a lot of times there's some interaction of that idea with the Passover story. We're covered up there.
Look like Wilson from
That's
Castaway.
yeah, it was kind of like
That's
poker.
okay.
Okay, no, we have to be serious. We're talking about theology. Yeah, no, but I think Spartans basically got it. I don't think there's a substitutionary idea happening there. I think there's an expiatory rite. I think there's a protection against death dealing spirits, even though they come from God, and a commemorative rite basically for to remember the fact that happened and that God did keep the Israelites from death dealing spirits.
Right.
So.
Good stuff. Jacob, how would William and Craig deal with Paul's paradigm of sin as a cosmic force? That's a great question.
I don't know.
My assumption would be if he's running with the sort of classic Ordo Salutis or Order of Salvation, he would probably put that in the realm of sanctification, where you're delivered and healed after you've become a Christian and you've been justified and you made your way into the church. So it's this process of sanctification where you get released from that. My issue is I think that's the principal problem for Paul, though. I don't see the juridical metaphors or the payment metaphors that he's running with up front to do with sin. I just think the power of sin and death and all of that stuff is what Paul thinks the primary problem is, confronting humanity. So it's interesting that when he's talking about atonement, he's not talking about the power of sin and death or the powers as these sort of cosmic kind of agents. Quasi-agents, whatever you want to call it. So I'm guessing he'd kind of partition that off into sanctification, whereas I think he actually needs to address that up front in his account of the atonement. And I think my kind of approach does a better job at that. Not to toot my own horn. But yeah, good question.
We did answer your question, Spartan.
This is from a long time ago.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
sorry.
So Isaac's not here.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a debate about this. Some people opt for Paul not kind of talking about himself or talking kind of autobiographically here. I think Paul's talking about himself.
Yeah.
I don't think there's great warrant for
I think the best
positions.
way to read that is as an aside to deal with the question of, I like Hazemon's answer for this, that this is an aside to deal with the question of, well, what do we do about the law? Well, we actually see the law has this very ambiguous force. So.
Right. Yeah, Aaron, if you're still on, I guess I haven't been confronted with the good. No, I wouldn't say that. I think that the good and God's goodness can be sensed in all sorts of things, even things that we wouldn't necessarily describe of as God showing up. But I think that even when we're not aware of it, God is pressing in on us. So I wouldn't just say that you were just shit out of luck and God hasn't confronted you with the good, right? I wouldn't want to say that. I'm just saying ultimately everyone will be kind of pulled back to the good because on my system, God is the good and created all things to be drawn back to himself in fellowship and communion in that loving family. So that's ultimate. It's okay, I think, if someone's not experiencing that right now. I think it's totally fine.
And God will meet them elsewhere. God does all the time. So,
at least that's what I believe. And it's totally okay if that's not something you're sensing right now. And I get it.
Yeah, I definitely get it, and I've been there. And I think one thing that for me is so important about universalism is it releases the feeling that we're on the clock.
Yes.
That there's there's something you have to experience or you have to feel immediately. And if you don't, then you're done. To me, getting rid of that sense of the time limit or the urgency, it made me trust God more, honestly. And I just think about myself in college and how much anxiety I had about folks who weren't Christians and what I needed to be doing. And kind of discovering universalism took a lot of that out. And it also made my relationships healthier. So, because I didn't have to worry about, getting folks to believe this or that. So,
yeah, good question from Carlos. If the wages of sin are death, don't we owe a debt to God himself? If so, someone has to pay, which coheres with PSA. I don't think that's what the text is doing.
Wage is doing.
So this is, I would go with what sort of Susan Eastman's reading of this, which is that if Paul's conception of sin is a power, or in an enslaving power, it's kind of like a taskmaster or a slave driver. It's kind of a horrible way of talking about, but that's really the sort of horrific reality of sin. So within this kind of metaphor, the idea of wages is what's being paid out from sin. So what's being paid out by sin is death. So the wages of sin are death. It's not that there's a debt that we owe to God that we have to pay and we can't do it, and so we need Jesus to be that payment. It's just simply that sin. It's the deal
that sin gives us.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's how I would handle that.
That's good. That's good. I like that. Jacob had a question for Bulbasaur.
I don't remember which question that was, but Bulbasaur, who's currently masked and doesn't speak English.
He's in a producing role right now. He's not.
He's really busy.
Yeah,
so.
He's super busy. So
I don't know if we missed anything, but
I don't think we did. Not seeing anything.
If you have any more questions, this is your last chance, and then we're gonna end the stream. We've been going for a little bit over an hour.
Yeah. I think Jacob's onto something here. I like this. Is this for Bulbasaur too? He's super busy. Okay.
PSA seems to limit the importance of Jesus's ministry to dying. Yeah. Doesn't that limit the importance of Jesus's life? What he lived for?
Yeah, what was the teaching ministry for? What was the resurrection for? And this is something that I remember just biographically, kind of coming to discover these ideas myself. I remember being a teenager and really struggling with the idea that that Easter mattered, because it actually seemed like, if anything, Easter was a bit of a cop-out. If Jesus died to satisfy this punishment, and he didn't even stay dead forever, it just seemed kind of lazy, to be honest. It just seemed, why is this better than anyone else's death? It's not even a permanent death. So I think there's a lot of truth to this. I think PSA robs us of the significance of the incarnation, of the spirit, of the ministry and the life of Jesus, and the role of Jesus in as a teacher and as a human, really. Because theoretically, with PSA, it's hard to get to the idea that God could have, why would Herod have killing Jesus not have been enough, right? If all that needed to happen was that Jesus was killed. So what's the problem? Yeah. I think that's a really good criticism. So
yeah, going back a bit, I don't remember exactly
Great
where this is.
question.
Where this was
Role
asked.
of the Spirit is always a great
Yeah,
question,
I mean,
though.
if we're talking about PSA, it's not even there. It's just not a
Yeah.
part of. It's kind of.
Oh, he comes along later.
Yeah, it's kind of a
Yeah.
non-Trinitarian. It's a
Yeah.
transaction between the Father and the Son. So the Spirit's kind of waiting for us to become Christians and transform us in sanctification. Again, it's because it's locked into this sort of order of salvation. For me, the Spirit plays a very central role in the atonement because the Spirit is the one who grafts us onto Christ and his journey unto death and his resurrection. So it's the Spirit is the one, she's the one who binds us to Christ and who brings us into his person. And so where I'm coming from, it's fundamentally Trinitarian, the process of the Father sends the Son lovingly into our condition where he assumes what we are and dies and is raised by the Father through the Spirit. The Spirit breathes life back into Jesus. And the same thing happens to us. We're bound to Christ by the Spirit, where we die and we're raised, and the Spirit breathes life into us, new life. So what's up, heathens? Oh wait, wrong show. A little bit late. I thought I saw one. Oh, any recommendations for
Jacob,
readings?
I didn't actually think you were asking a question of Bulbasaur.
I did, so thank you for clarifying. Yeah, I appreciate that. Any recommendations for introductory readings on Neil's take on all of this? Appreciate the discussion. Depends on which part exactly, but I would say for the atonement stuff, I would go with
we had an atonement in the Old Testament reading list on our last video.
It's on this one.
Oh, it's on this one too. Okay, awesome.
Yep.
For Universalism, Ideas of Universalism, I think That All Shall Be Saved by David Bentley Hart. And then for participatory readings of the Spirit in Incarnation, there's a few. Douglas Campbell's Pauline Dogmatics. One of the foundational folks to read on more of this incarnational idea of, dying and rising with Jesus. Maybe the second half of E.P. Sanders' Paul and Palestinian Judaism might be helpful.
Yeah.
That work has been updated extensively since, but it's the foundation, basically. Yeah. It's
not quite Trinitarian enough, I think. But as far as the participatory stuff, he's kind of one of the big guys early on for that. Douglas Campbell's work is good.
What's about Chris Tilling's work?
Yeah, he's doing stuff with divine identity, though.
Yeah, that's true.
But I'm writing a book on this that'll be out hopefully next year. So if that's helpful. The other thing I would point you toward is the series that we did on the gospel for this channel.
Yeah.
So those are also linked in the description. I did 3 videos on God's purposes, God's solution, and the problem, where I kind of walk through how we're approaching that in a hopefully simple way with PowerPoints and pictures. And so it's,
very accessible.
Take a look at those if you haven't already. Awesome. But thanks everybody so much for coming.
Thank you so much. This was really fun. Thank you, Haden, if you're watching this.
Thanks for all your questions too and your engagement with us. We appreciate people watching our videos.
We really do. Every time someone logs in, it's really fun. So
But thank you everyone. And for that, this has been Apocalypse Now. Christianity you can live with.
Having such terrible thoughts,